Leading our discussion today is Tom Spohr, who serves as director of our Center for National Defense in the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. Before joining Heritage earlier last year, he served for over 36 years in the U.S. Army, attaining the rank of Lieutenant General. Among his previous military assignments, he has been Director of the Army Office of Business Transformation in the Office of the Undersecretary of the Army, Director of Program and Analysis and Evaluation, Headquarters Department of the Army, Deputy Commanding General Support, United States Forces in Iraq, among others. Please join me in welcoming Tom Spohr. Tom?
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. Heritage is indeed honored today to host Dr. Elliot Cohen for today's book event. Dr. Cohen is the Robert E. Osgood Professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. He directs the university's Strategic Studies programs and the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies, which he founded. Dr. Cohen is one of our nation's foremost national security scholars and writers, having written 4 critically acclaimed books, co-authored many others, and authored numerous articles and studies. He received his undergraduate and graduate degrees, his doctorate, from Harvard College, and has worked in both academic and government settings, significantly as a member of the policy planning staff at the Office of the Secretary of Defense and as counselor for the Department of State. Hugely important for me, Dr. Cohen has also served as an officer in the Army Reserve, with assignments including the Office of Net Assessment, Office of the Secretary of Defense, and as an adjunct professor at the U.S. Army War College. He was a special advisor on foreign and defense policy to the presidential campaign of Governor Mitt Romney. Dr. Cohen is the father of an Army Iraq veteran and of a serving naval officer. He's a thoughtful scholar of our nation's security, and we're lucky to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cohen.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. It's great to be back at Heritage. I've always admired and appreciated the work that you do. And it's good to be here talking about my new book, The Big Stick, The Limits of Soft Power and the Necessity of Military Force. At least it's an unambiguous title. So the title, of course, The Big Stick, is famously associated with Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, the USS Theodore Roosevelt is called The Big Stick. Speak softly and carry a big stick. I begin the book by going back to the speech in which Roosevelt invoked that old proverb. And it is an interesting and revealing speech. The title of the speech is National Duties. And Roosevelt delivered it when he was vice president. He very self-consciously delivered it in the American heartland. It was at the Minnesota State Fair, September 3rd, 1901. And it includes this passage. We can be certain of one thing. Whether we wish it or not, we cannot avoid hereafter having duties to do in the face of other nations. All that we can do is to settle whether we shall perform these duties well or ill. 4 days later, President McKinley was shot. 2 weeks later, Theodore Roosevelt became president. He was, I think, the first of our presidents. I think all of our presidents understood the United States was globally engaged. It's one of the great myths of American history to think we were ever isolated from world affairs. We were not. There were a number of world wars before what we think of as the world wars, and they all either originated here or we ended up taking part in them, really ever since the end of the 17th century. But Roosevelt was the first who saw the United States as a global power. No coincidence that he's the guy who decided to paint the battle fleet of the United States Navy white and send it around the world as a way of saying, we're here. Since the day that Roosevelt gave that speech, since the days when the United States accepted that it had a global role to play, the military price that it has paid for doing that is quite high. 626,000 dead, twice as many wounded, trillions of dollars spent. The cost of maintaining a military that is more than 10 times the size, simply in terms of personnel, than the one that Theodore Roosevelt constructed for the United States. And in a way, the question behind the book is, well, why? Was it worth it then? And more importantly, will it be worth it in the years to come? I wrote the book for three reasons. First, I wanted to engage in what I believed and believe is a belated debate that is now occurring. It is the debate that should have occurred at the end of the Cold War, when it would have made sense for the United States to revisit the question of what is our role in the world. After all, there had been a foreign policy consensus that emerged at the end of World War II, in some ways actually even during World War II, that the United States had to play a global role as a guarantor of world order, that it had to help build that order and then maintain it, particularly in the face of the Soviet threat. That debate did not happen in the early 1990s, and it's worth asking ourselves why. There are a number of reasons. I think the first was that in the 1990s, American leadership and American predominance looked cheap, and it was cheap. Other people, after all, paid for the first Gulf War. Casualties were, by any historical standard, extremely low, and that continued, of course, in the Yugoslav civil wars. So in the 1990s, there was no particular pressure to have the debate. In the 2000s, of course, the possibility of having it got swept away by the events of 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the continuing jihadi threat, and so forth. So in some ways, what we're now doing is finally having that debate. Almost 25 years after what was the triggering event, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. One of the consequences of that delay, I would argue, is that our defense policy and our defense debate essentially became divorced from our foreign policy. And it became more and more abstract, more and more disconnected from what it is that the United States wants to do in the world. And so the first purpose of the book was to try to engage in that larger debate about the American role in the world, and I tend to be very much a traditionalist, believing it's very important for the United States to play a large role, and in so doing, to bring defense back. And that leads me to the second reason for writing the book, and that is I've always thought that it's very foolish to talk about diplomatic options on the one hand, military options on the other, as if they are two separate things. They are not. As I know from my own experience as counselor of the Department of State, but certainly as an historian, which is what I really am, the fact is that diplomacy and military power go hand in hand. They're part together of foreign policy, and it's a mistake to separate them, although what has happened, particularly in recent years, is that the communities who think about foreign policy and who think about defense policy have much less to do with one another than one might think. So then a second purpose of the book is to bridge the communities and to bridge the debate. The third reason to write the book was this. It struck me that George W. Bush did not intend to become a wartime commander-in-chief, but that's what he became. Barack Obama, I think in a different way, somewhat less excusably in my view, also did not intend to be a wartime commander-in-chief, and yet that, for better or worse, is what he was. Donald Trump, I suspect, does still not think of himself as a wartime commander-in-chief, and yet that is what he too is doomed to be. And so one of the things that I would like to do in the book, and that I try to do particularly in the last chapter, is to get people thinking about, and to help people think through, well, what is the logic of hard power? How should one think about being a wartime commander-in-chief, about the application of military power to pursue political ends, which is what we've been doing for the last 15 years, and I very strongly believe we'll be doing it at least for the next 15. So the core issue is the use of military power and its role in maintaining global order. Let me summarize the chapters of the book. I have a terrific and ferocious editor at Basic Books who kept on simplifying the outline, and I wish all of you who are writers an editor as good as Laura Heimert. The first chapter is entitled, Why the United States? Why the United States? Why should the United States be globally engaged? Why should the United States be committed to the maintenance of world order? And as I try to do throughout the book, I try to give as good an argument as I can on the other side. And in particular, I look at 5 arguments for why this is no longer necessary and no longer makes sense. One of them is the argument made by the psychologist Steven Pinker in a very interesting book, The Better Angels, which makes a case that actually war is much less prevalent in the world. In fact, President Obama made this case as well, that on the whole, despite what you read in the papers, the world is becoming a more and more peaceful place in which hard power plays less and less of a role. Second argument, what I call Pacific realism, that is to say the argument that, well, no, that's not the nature of the world, but the balance of power operates in this fairly automatic way, and without engaging too much, things will sort themselves out. There'll be kind of regional balances of power, and the United States does not have to do a whole lot. Third argument is that soft power can substitute for hard power. By the way, the subtitle of the book is The Limits of Soft Power. I'm not saying soft power doesn't exist, but I do explore its limits. The fourth argument, advanced by a number of people, including Andy Bacevich at Boston University, is the United States is simply incompetent to exert hard power and shouldn't even try. An argument for which, there's a certain amount of evidence, although in the end not convincing. And then the fifth argument, nation building at home. That really, maybe the United States has these roles to play abroad, but there has to be a renewed focus on nation building at home. One of the things I point out in that chapter, and I would point out to you, is don't think that these are left, right, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal kinds of disagreements. I mean, there's a certain way in which Donald Trump is making the nation building at home argument. Now, he's making it while arguing for a military buildup, but it is, in its essence, it is not dissimilar from what Barack Obama, who did say we need some nation building at home, was saying. And I think one of the things that's very important, perhaps particularly at a think tank like this one, is to say, well, we're going to have to move beyond our normal understanding of what the opposition between two different sides is. The second chapter is about 15 years of war. The title is just 15 years of war. What do we take away from that experience? That was the hardest chapter to write because I was involved in some of those events. I had some views which I now think were misplaced, other views which were confirmed, particularly about Iraq. But what I try to do is pull together the stories of Iraq, Afghanistan, and the war against jihadi terror, the way in which those wars were separate, but also, more importantly, the way in which they were connected, the ways in which we still can't think entirely straight about them, partly because of partisan rancor, but partly because we don't have historical perspective. And again, my last book was mainly about 18th century military history, and that taught me a humbling lesson about how long it takes to really get perspective on your own time and the world that you live in. The third chapter is called The American Hand, and that is really about what is it that the United States brings to the table in international politics, not just in terms of military power, although there's also kind of an audit of American military power. And the basic contention there is the American hand remains extremely strong because of the power of our economy, the diversity of our society, our demographic profile, things which are probably familiar to you. But I do argue that that hand is, relatively speaking, weaker than it has been in the past, which I believe is the case. And we can talk about what the implications of that are. But the fundamental conclusion from that is the United States can continue to play the role that, if it chooses to, something like the role that is played in the past, but it has less room to maneuver than perhaps it did before. There are then 4 chapters on what I take to be the main national security challenges to which hard power is relevant. China, the jihadi threat, a chapter on what I call dangerous states, and I would include Russia, Iran, and North Korea in there, states which are essentially regional powers and which are revisionist powers. They don't like the order in their immediate environs, and they want to change that. And then fourthly, the challenge of ungoverned space, and the commons. That can include virtual space, cyberspace, but also outer space and so forth. That ordering was deliberate. I put China first and jihadi second. That's not clear to me that that's the view of the Trump administration, but I may be wrong. And then the final chapter is called The Logic of Hard Power. And there are a number of things in there, but probably the one that's most important is I take on the famous Weinberger rules. And in November 1984, then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger laid out 6 rules for the use of military force. It got him into a big debate with Secretary of State George Shultz. But those 6 rules have had a lot of carrying power, and I thought it was worthwhile taking them on because they sound perfectly sensible, but I think they fall apart on close examination. And instead, I came up with my own 6, not rules, but guidelines for thinking about the kinds of wars that we're likely to encounter, and I believe we will encounter them. In terms of how to think about armed force, I would say that there are really, in many ways, 5 points that are central to the book. The first is the book very much makes the case that we are in an extraordinarily uncertain era. Extraordinarily uncertain. And this, to my mind, undermines a lot of the case for what is sometimes called grand strategy. Secondly, I make the case that we need to define and order our problems. And here I think I'm particularly concerned that the tendency to focus on, say, the Islamic State runs the risk of distorting how we think about the nature of our defense and strategic problems. And the difficulty, of course, that we have is that the sorts of forces we need for those different challenges that I describe in those 4 chapters are not necessarily fungible. That is, and it's not just that they're not fungible in terms of, carrier battle groups may be a lot less useful for dealing with jihadis than for dealing with China. It's also that the mode of strategic thought has to be very different. So, for example, I'm quite taken with something that the chief of the Australian Army, Peter Leahy, said, that we are in a 100-year war with radical Islam. Well, that's a very sobering thought. Although it's also, if you think about it the right way, I believe it's a more reassuring thought than it looks. But that's very different, I think, from how we think about the security of Eastern Europe, for example. Thirdly, I would argue that there is strategic discontinuity in a number of ways, but one of the ways in which that's the case has to do with our strategic concepts. And I go on a bit of a riff about what I call strategic pixie dust. The tendency to just invoke terms which meant a lot during the Cold War, but which may mean a lot less than they do now. Deterrence, for example, has in many ways become a kind of strategic pixie dust that we sprinkle over problems, or in the NATO context, Article 5. The new members of NATO are presumably protected by Article 5 guarantees. Well, not entirely clear that those are self-enforcing. I do believe we have to think hard about the last 15 years and what to learn from them. That's important both for civilian decision makers. It's also important for the military as an institution. I'm not sure that that has happened to the extent that is a healthy thing. And then finally, I talk about mobilizational thinking, that it seems to me that given the rough contours of our budget, even assuming a substantial increase in defense spending, which I'm all in favor of, and I think will happen to some extent, given the nature of the environment and given the nature of the threats we face, the United States is going to have to revert in part to a concept which really dominated our thinking throughout most of our history, and that is that whatever your active duty forces structure is when you go into a conflict, you're going to have to create more of it once you're actually engaged. We obviously think of World War II as this enormous expansion of American military power, but it's also the improvisational nature of it. I've recently been reading Richard Snow's wonderful book, Iron Dawn, about the Monitor and the Merrimack. And it's so striking just how much ingenuity and innovation went into the creation of really brand new weapon systems during the Civil War. I don't think we're very good at that. You know, when I look at how hard it was to expand force structure during the Iraq and Afghan wars, when I look at how difficult it was to bring things like MRAPs to the battlefield, when I look at how poor a job we did of mobilizing the vast cultural talent that we have in this country for use overseas, I really think we lost something. We need to recover it. Let me just conclude. You know, I was a pretty severe critic of the Obama administration, but I certainly gave President Obama credit for sincerity. There is no question in my mind that he intended to really get us out of Iraq altogether. You know, I think if he could have, he would have put Iraq on an ice floe and just, you know, sent it off drifting towards the North Pole. He believed that he could, and I think for a time believed that he had shut down al-Qaeda effectively with the killing of Osama bin Laden. He certainly believed that he would be able to end the Afghan war. He certainly believed that it would be a good thing for the United States to retrench a bit, to stop using military power as much as he believed his predecessor had. And he thought it was extremely important to do so in accordance with some very high standards of conduct. So what's happened? He launched the third Iraq War. That's essentially what we're engaged in now. First Iraq War was 1991, second Iraq War 2003. We are now in our third Iraq War, and there are thousands of American servicemen and women engaged in it. He doubled down in Afghanistan. He engaged in another war in support of our European allies in Libya, overthrowing a regime with consequences that are still with us. He increased by an order of magnitude a campaign of, you can call it targeted killing if you wish, you can call it assassination if you don't like it, but certainly the largest campaign of its kind that has ever been waged by a state. He has ordered American ships to sail really close to Chinese man-made islands in the South China Sea. And he returned armored forces to Europe, really for the first time since the Cold War, reversing a trend that had really accelerated under his presidency. He didn't do any of those things because he was a hypocrite. He didn't do any of those things because he had a fundamental change of heart, I think, about the American role in the world. He found himself, I believe, compelled by circumstances. And so I tend to believe that there is a logic at work which will keep us engaged globally. But to use Teddy Roosevelt's words, all that we can do is to settle whether we shall perform these duties well or ill. So let me stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions or comments you might have.
Dr. Cohen, that was absolutely wonderful, and there's a lot of material to go in there. A couple of quick admin announcements. Dr. Cohen has graciously agreed to sign books at the end of this. They are for sale if you don't have one out in the lobby, and then I think the book signing will take place in here as long as it needs to take. Secondly, there will be lunch out there, I think, as well. And thirdly, in the question phase, if you wouldn't mind standing, if you have an organization, tell us what it is, and then wait for a microphone so that our listeners on remote stations can hear what your question was. So, who has a question? Sorry.
Focusing on Middle Eastern and Russian threats, distracting us from the much more important long-term challenge that China poses.
Well, you know, the difficulty, it seems to me, is that it's, I think China is the largest strategic challenge in many ways, but the jihadi threat is chronic, and the Russian one is potentially very dangerous. It doesn't have to be as dangerous as it now is. The reason why I say it's particularly dangerous is not because Russia is structurally a strong power. It's not. But because, for a variety of reasons, the Obama administration and quite possibly the Trump administration have not really been willing to be pretty aggressive about dealing with it. It is, in principle, the solutions are not that hard. A much stronger presence, particularly in Eastern Europe, and a lot of effort to doing what we always do, which is pushing and prodding our European allies to spend more on defense and to pushing back on the Russians. I mean, their hand is fundamentally a lot weaker. But because we haven't done that, and because of who is in charge in the Kremlin, I think in terms of an immediate challenge, it's actually quite severe. And the reason why I think it's severe is this. Vladimir Putin did accept the end of the Cold War. I don't think he had a particular emotional commitment to that. He could accept the end of the Warsaw Pact. He could even, to a point, accept the end of the Soviet Union, although I think his understanding of Russia is a much more expansive understanding of that country and its borders than you and I would probably share. But I think what he cannot accept, and many of his ilk, I don't think this is simply personal to him, is the persistence of NATO. And what he would like to do is to break it up. And the easiest way to break it up, which is risky, but it may look less risky to him, is you do something to, say, one of the Baltic states, which are in NATO, and you don't necessarily roll in with lots of tanks, but you do something, and they invoke Article 5, and the Germans say, was ist das? Article 5. And if there is not a strong NATO response to that kind of, not completely ambiguous, but somewhat ambiguous aggression, then effectively you're blowing up NATO. And you're blowing up what it rests on, which is Article 5. And the problem is, I would say largely, but not entirely, on the other side of the Atlantic. There was a big survey of German public opinion which showed something like 70% of the German population did not think that Germany should respond to a Russian invasion of one of the Baltic states. That's very disturbing. What this calls for is American leadership, and it's American leadership to articulate the value of NATO, the importance of NATO, yes, to kind of cajole and persuade and, if necessary, bludgeon our allies into spending more, but not to saying that it's obsolete, not to threatening to walk away from it, not disparaging it as a bad deal. The fundamental problem that the United States has, the United States always has this problem. Our leaders have to deal with everything all at once. If you're Bashar al-Assad, you can focus on some very immediate problems, and because he's not stupid, he can actually be pretty effective at that. Even Vladimir Putin, he doesn't really have to think about Latin America or Africa, or even he has to think less about the Middle East than we do, or Asia. So he can be much more focused on the Russian periphery. An American president, an American Secretary of State, an American Secretary of Defense, an American Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have to think about the entire globe. And that's, even no matter how able they are and how able their staffs are, that puts us at a certain kind of strategic disadvantage.
Next question, please. Sir.
Dr. Cohen, I'm Greg Huger. I'm a retired USAID Foreign Service officer and executive at Unocal Oil Company. I'd appreciate your comments on the role of hard power, the big stick, and soft power in areas of the world, including Afghanistan, many parts of the Middle East, Central America, and others, where the governments and the societies are quite dysfunctional and create a base for recruitment and development of terrorism and threats to the United States and our allies. The balance of hard and soft power in those contexts.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. Again, let me stress, soft power plays an important role in many ways. And soft power can mean many different things. It can mean aid programs, the sort of things USAID does. It can mean the openness of our society of our universities, say, to people from abroad. It can be the appeal of American culture. It can even be the English language. The first thing I would say is those things are real. They all have limits. Let me take something, since I'm a professor, that's near and dear to my heart, and that is the attractiveness of American universities to foreign students. I think that's tremendously important. No question in my mind that that is a source of real strength. On the other hand, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the 9/11 plotters, got his bachelor's degree from a university in North Carolina. So there are no guarantees of that. Or, since I see we've got some of our British allies sitting right in front of me, I've mentioned that I've spent a bit of time in the 18th century. And, I assure you, the senior commanders of the British Army, almost without exception, were fluent in French, which was the civilized language of the time. It didn't prevent them from spending like a century and a half battering away at the French. So I think it's important to keep some sense of the limits of that. I think one of the things we really need to do, and that we haven't done, is a really serious after-action review on the combination of hard and soft power that we brought to bear in Afghanistan and Iraq. I will tell you that the conclusion I came to after, and that was my portfolio when I was at State, and obviously I've spent some time thinking about it, is that we exaggerated some of the soft power side of what we could do to the point of actually causing damage. So as you know, you bring in lots of aid personnel into a country, and what's the first thing they need? Well, they need lots of interpreters. Well, who do they get as the interpreters? They get the people who probably should be teaching high school, because they can pay a lot more. Or you get situations where you're doing things for the locals that really they should be doing for themselves. And in fact, I vividly remember this, particularly in Afghanistan, where sometimes you're undermining the government that you're there to support, because the locals turn to you for the goodies rather than establishing some sort of rapport with their government. So I think we have to be a lot smarter about how we do it. And the conclusion I came to is, in those sorts of settings, what we can do is we can provide useful security assistance. And thereafter, probably the most useful thing we can do is in the education and training area, rather than very large aid projects, or even sometimes very small ones. I'll mention one probably familiar to you, General, from your Iraq time, a typical kind of thing. So I remember visiting a provincial reconstruction team. I think it was maybe near Tikrit, and came across the following story. So the local brigade commander had the SERP money, the Commander's Emergency Response Program money, which is, was occasionally usefully used to buy off people who would otherwise be planting IEDs. But in this case, you have to spend the money, can't just return it to the Treasury. So it was clear that the locals needed a better water supply than they had. So we bought a brand new German portable water filtration plant, best German technology, which was great. And the locals were very happy for 6 months, and he went away and thought he'd been completely successful. His successor, with whom I spoke, had a different story because, of course, nobody had kind of arranged this with the Iraqis. So there's nobody in the Iraqi government who thought that they owned that thing. There was no training pipeline for the engineers to operate it. Most importantly, there was no money built into anybody's budget for repair and maintenance. So, surprise, surprise, 6 to 9 months later, the thing broke down. And now the locals were furious because obviously, we put man on the moon, we must have deliberately given them a water filtration plant that we knew would break. And the only question was, why were we doing that to them? I was just thinking that ended up being completely counterproductive. So I think there is a need to think these things through very carefully. The last thing I'll say is we have developed some terrific soft power tools, particularly in the sanctions world. If you think, for example, of our ability to make it very hard to do business in some countries if we want. And those are useful tools to have, say, vis-a-vis the Iranians. On the other hand, despite the rather robust sanctions that were imposed on the Iranians and the North Koreans, both countries have ended up with enough centrifuges to make nuclear weapons. And so we just need to have a sober appreciation of the limits of soft power, as indeed of the limits of hard power, too.
In the back.
Thank you for your talk. Jonathan Ward from the Changing Character of War program at University of Oxford. I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on your thoughts about China as the principal geostrategic challenge for the United States. How the United States might approach that, and also whether or not you think China is principally sort of an Asia-Pacific geostrategic challenge or really a global one. Thank you.
I think it will be mainly regional. The reason why China is such a major challenge is because it has such a powerful economy and such a powerful sense of itself. None of the other countries that I've mentioned have quite that. There's also, I buy some of the political science which says, rising power, status quo power, recipe for trouble. But beyond that, it's quite clear that the Chinese really do have this sense of their role in the Asia-Pacific as being the Middle Kingdom and requiring, if not tribute, then a certain degree of subservience from the people around them. They certainly have a very expansive view of what their rights in the South China Sea are. And I think that poses a number of long-term challenges. First, we don't want them really violating some of those principles of international order, including free passage in the maritime domain that are really important. Secondly, we don't want them effectively either dismantling our alliances on the one hand, causing, say a South Korea or a Japan simply to accommodate them, nor, on the other hand, do we want a situation where Japan gets so alarmed that they decide, really, what we need is nuclear weapons. There's some political scientists who think, well, the world's much safer if everybody has nuclear weapons, and to which my response is, maybe you want to live in the middle of a political science field experiment, but I don't. And I just think it ends up with we end up in a much more unstable place. And it is also finally very clear, if you look at Chinese force structure and what they're trying to do, is they would like to push us out of their immediate environs. And they are very explicit about that. I suppose the last thing I would say is they do have a history of making big miscalculations. And in the book I talk a bit about this. I don't buy that, the kind of Chinese fortune cookie school of sinology, which says, boy, these guys are just thinking so far ahead. I quote, there's that famous story where Kissinger asks Mao, what do you think about the French Revolution? And he says, it's too soon to tell. Well, Chas Freeman, who was the interpreter, I forget whether it was Mao or Zhou Enlai, so actually, this happens right after the riots in Paris in 1968. That's what he was asking about. And he said, well, too soon to tell, which, any sensible person would have said. He was not talking about the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. They have made mistakes before, and they can make mistakes again. And the older I get, the more I worry about stupid things happening when you have enough inflammable tensions. Now, again, I don't think this is an insuperable problem, because if you look at our portfolio of allies, particularly in the region, we should be in pretty good shape. Japan, Australia, Singapore, in a different way, Vietnam, under a less insane president, the Philippines, in an emerging partnership with India, which is tremendously important. But this is where, again, hard power and soft power come together. The job of diplomacy is to cultivate your alliances, first and foremost. That is the most important thing we can do right now, is to deepen and strengthen and make as robust as possible a whole series of alliance relationships abroad, so that you don't end up in a shooting war, or you don't end up being pushed out of Asia. And it's one of the reasons why I get very uneasy when we begin talking about alliances as if they're real estate deals, because they're not.
Hi, Hi, my name is Sarah Owens with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I was wondering, for the U.S. to protect its national security with hard power, how important is it for the U.S. to continue to follow and develop the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law?
I think it's actually quite important. And I would, I very much associate myself with, he's now a civilian, but military leaders like General Jim Mattis, who I think fully understood this. The challenge that we've had in dealing, particularly with the jihadi threat, is you're not dealing with normal combatants. And, military law has always wrestled with this. So the first real military legal code in the United States wrestled with this. That's the Lieber Code during the Civil War, when the Secretary of War asked Francis Lieber, who was a German law professor at Columbia, I believe, to draft a code for the use of the Union Army. And the difficult challenge was, okay, well, what do we do about the Confederate guerrillas that we have out west? And I think the Lieber Code standards were they have to be in kind of military sort of organizations. They have to have some, and they have to have some sort of insignia or something. It can be, a cluster of oak leaves or something like that. And then there was a third test, which I forget. But in any case, they were wrestling with that. And military organizations have always wrestled with, what do you do with irregular combatants? Because you can't just shoot them. Under the Lieber Code, you could if they didn't meet the tests, and that did happen. The challenge you have now is this protracted conflict. And I've always thought that on the one hand, I have no problem with Guantanamo. On the other hand, I thought at the time that the Bush administration was making a mistake by not being very aggressive in sending our international lawyers out there to meet with our allies and say, look, we are facing an unprecedented kind of situation. We are in this open-ended conflict. The people we are picking up, we cannot simply deal with through the court system. It would be better if we could, but there will be people that, for a whole bunch of reasons, you cannot deal with through a normal domestic legal process. We need some other set of rules of the road. Let's develop these collectively. And I wish we had done that, and I still think that that is the right thing to do. Instead, what we've done is we've had this oscillation, but we tend to have an oscillation between saying, look, we can do whatever we like, and on the other hand, saying, well, we're going to treat this into a matter of domestic law enforcement. I don't believe that at all. But, a large part of American power in the world is our reputation. And that's from the very beginning, Remember the Declaration of Independence, a decent regard for the opinion of mankind. That's why Thomas Jefferson said we've got to explain why we're doing what we're doing. And, why we no longer want to be run by these guys. It's tremendously important, I think. And it is completely consonant with being very tough-minded at the same time.
Steve Rodriguez with One Defense. Tom, thanks for doing this in LA. Good to see you. I guess piggybacking off the answer to your last question related to the character of our foreign policy, are you concerned at all about on-ramps or off-ramps to conflict, both from our side as well as some of the people that we assume might be near-term combatants? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I'm quite getting.
Basically, when you get in a shoving match, are there on ramps or off ramps to back down, or are you kind of led into a downward spiral that leads towards major theater war?
So I guess, in a way, you might say I'm in favor of making mistakes deliberately. On the one hand, I believe that you will make mistakes, or that you will get into interactions that you don't expect. When I was a graduate student, I used to think, you never really get into a war unless both sides are really kind of looking for a war. I no longer believe that. I believe really stupid things can happen, and you can blunder into something very serious. It doesn't happen completely accidentally, but just my faith in human short-sightedness and stupidity and impulsiveness has grown over time. That makes it all the more important to have orderly, deliberate decision-making processes. And by and large, we usually have that. You can have the best decision-making process in the world and still end up with really bad outcomes. But it's why you really don't want to go off half-cocked. And you don't want to just go on the basis of instinct. And that seems to me is going to be your best way of avoiding something really stupid from happening. And also explaining to the American people what you're doing. That's also, you know, again, I would fault in a way both the Bush and the Obama administrations for not investing a lot more effort than they did into making the case to the American people for why we are doing what we're doing and really engaging it as if it's an argument. It's I think, part of the story of the failure of political rhetoric in this country in recent years.
Stephen Elkovich, the American University of Paris, and the first American to participate in the French War College. If this president is doomed also to be a wartime president like previous presidents, and if, once again, foreign policy and defense policy cannot be separated, they're intimately related, how does this president bring that together? And since I live and work in France and in Europe, how can that relationship between defense policy and foreign policy be melded with the same intimate relationship with our allies?
Well, it's like being an alcoholic. First, you have to realize you've got a problem. And he does have a problem. And his fundamental problem, I believe, is that he does not, as far as I can tell, see the need for a highly disciplined process. And you know, that sounds incredibly wonky and inside the beltway, and you know, as though I'm a career bureaucrat, which I'm not. I'm a school teacher and a failed political activist. But the first thing is to understand that you have to do this in an integrated, coordinated way, and that there's no way that any individual can pull this all together. You know, in a way, I think he's got a lot of the raw ingredients there, in that he's got a Secretary of State and a Secretary of Defense who are very mature, experienced, worldly people who I suspect share very common views. And that's, I mean, I don't know Director Pompeo as well, but that's certainly my impression of Director Pompeo. If Dan Coates becomes DNI, same thing. Really, the question is at the heart of the White House. And you know, one of the hardest things for American presidents to accept is that they may think that they're speaking to domestic audiences, but they're actually speaking as well to foreign audiences. And this always struck me when I was in the State Department that, you know, goat herds in Kandahar were following presidential speeches in a kind of indirect way, but they were aware of them. And that's something that you just have to socialize people to. And then the last thing I would say is, you know, if I could persuade him of anything, it's that George Shultz was right when he said your alliances are like gardening. That's how you think about it. You're just constantly tending them. When I was at State, about every 6 weeks, I'd be going to Europe with my friend Eric Edelman, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And what we were doing was gardening. And the upshot of it was that by the end of the Bush administration, we actually had a terrific relationship with the French, in particular, with whom, as you may recall, we didn't start out that way. And was, for me, that was a great lesson in what you can do if you are really sort of patient about cultivating your allies. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't mean you have to go along with what they say. It doesn't mean you have to sit down with them and talk to them, and much more importantly, listen to them. And then say, well, we're not going to do that. We understand your points, but we're not going to do that for the following reasons. So these are the basics, and the question will be whether and how quickly the core of this administration, the White House, will accept that.
Dr. Cohen, thank you very much for those remarks. Can you join me in a round of applause? You know, the book is less than 250 pages. It doesn't have all those thick footnotes that you have to read to understand the entire text of the book. And so I commend the book to you. It is for sale out in the lobby, and Dr. Cohen, again, has agreed to sign books if you're interested. So, sir, thank you again.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.